Space Engineers 2 Survival and Planets update has just been released, and it was one of the first stepping stones along the game's early access roadmap. If you want to see everything added in this update, you can check out this video on screen here, but I know the important question on everyone's minds now is what is coming next, and more importantly, when is it coming? The developers have recently revealed an updated early access roadmap that we'll be going through, most of it coming over the course of the next year, and additionally, there's a bunch of other interesting information that I've collated from different developer diaries and live streams. So let's dive in. One of the first new things you can expect are new contracts and sectors, and whilst it says Q1 2026 on the roadmap, we've actually received a new sector already. As you can see on this image here, on December the 22nd, there was a live stream to celebrate the release of the Obliviara sector, and as that's in the past, this sector is available in-game right now. If you open up the map in Space Engineers 2, you can see we have all of our sectors here, and the Obliviara sector is this one here. Wait, Obliviara? I thought it was Obliviara. Anyway, to access the Obliviara sector, you first need to 100% colonize the Verger and Chemic sectors, and once you have, you can then fast travel to the new sector and then colonize that one as well. And I would imagine over the next few months, the game will be updated with more sectors with more new contracts to complete. I've covered the new colonization system in depth in both a dedicated video on the topic, as well as in my video covering what was added in the survival update. But if you want to aware, each sector in Space Engineers 2 has a station in it, and inside that station there is a contract block which will supply you contracts, and these are kind of like quests where you do a couple of tasks, and then when you complete them you unlock additional blocks, and also improve your colonization progress. And once your colonization progress is maxed out in the sector, you unlock the ability to fast travel from your current station to the station in the neighbouring sector, so you continue to colonize the Almager system, the star system that Space Engineers 2 takes place in. The contracts that are currently in Space Engineers 2 are kind of the early game beginner ones, as they're kind of here to introduce you to how Space Engineers 2 works and how it's different from Space Engineers 1, and also teach you the game as it goes through. So I'm really interested to see how they expand on contracts in these new sectors, as presumably they'll become a bit more complex and a bit more involved as we move into later game areas of the map. However, the contracts that are currently in the game are limited by the fact there aren't things like NPCs, and there aren't things like combat in the game yet, which are things on the roadmap that we'll be discussing later in the video. But so far, even with these limitations, I think the contract system is very good, so I look forward to seeing how it expands in the future. As we know pretty concretely, when the next major update for Space Engineers 2 is releasing, which is the Survival Extensions update down here, we can assume that over the next few months we might get a couple extra sectors and contracts to go with each of those sectors as well, and I imagine that will continue after this major update until all the sectors in the game are eventually populated. But as we've mentioned this next major update, we might as well talk about it. Vertical Slice 2.2 Survival Extensions is currently planned to release around March-April time, and it will add a bunch of features that I know many players are interested in getting their hands on. Most notably pistons and rotors, which you can see on screen here, and you can even see that the piston in Space Engineers 2 is much longer than its Space Engineers 1 counterpart. There is a third mechanical block from Space Engineers 1 that isn't going to be in this update, and that's the hinge. It is something that's planned, it's just not going to be ready for this update. We'll also be getting new block tools in this update, specifically the welder and grinder. These are currently in the files for the game and they can be accessed, but they're currently not functional. And as I said on my video covering the release of the update, I believe this is the case as the production system isn't fully complete yet. So if they're adding the welder and grinder block in the 2.2 update, it stands to reason that production overhaul might be on its way as well. But we haven't been told that concretely yet. It just lines up with a couple of other things that I'll explain later. Weapons I know are a big thing for a lot of people, and they will be coming in this update. This includes both hand weapons and block weapons. As you can see on screen here are the images of the rocket launcher, and additionally the rifle. And here you can see the Space Engineers 2 version of the Gatling turret, which I love way more than the Space Engineers 1 counterpart. This looks so much better. And hopefully with the way the building system works in Space Engineers 2, you'll actually be able to place blocks right up to the edge of the block, as opposed to how it works in Space Engineers 1, where you have to leave this massive 2.5 meter gap around the turret. And additionally with the new weapons, there's also going to be a new tool added in this update called the Area Welder, which as you can imagine is a separate tool from the welder, which welds in an area, and as you can see from this concept art here, it looks like you have to select multiple blocks with this Area Welder, or potentially an area, and then when you activate the welder, it shoots out like a beam of electricity that arcs between blocks in order to weld them up. In Space Engineers 2, if you aren't aware, the new 25cm grid system allows you to both place tiny 25cm blocks and also large 2.5 meter blocks on the same grid. And whilst this system is a big improvement, it's also a big pain to individually weld up all of those small individual blocks. And additionally, due to the new projection building system, you're able to place down projections of finished blocks and design ships with projections before you weld them up. However, it is very difficult to weld up these projected blocks if they are behind other blocks, so a tool like the Area Welder would also be a good solution to that. And also currently, I feel like you need to get very close with the welder in order to start welding up a block, so maybe this new tool will resolve that issue as well. It'll be interesting to see how this area welder will be different from the normal welder we have, and in what circumstances you would or wouldn't use the normal welder over it. And additionally, I'd be curious if this area welder technology will also be applied to the block welders as well, and maybe that's part of the reason they've been delayed until this update. There's a feature called block wrappers that's coming in this update, which is basically the idea that you can bundle components together into a single item in your inventory. Say for example you wanted to build something like a solar panel, you could manufacture this bundle of components, a block wrapper for a solar panel. It would contain all the components in it, and then you can go up to the solar panel knowing that you have all the components needed in your inventory to weld it up. The block wrapper system kind of ties in with that improved production system I was mentioning a minute ago. In Space Engineers 2, components are combined together to craft more advanced components. And then from there, if you're creating a block wrapper of those components, there's a lot of steps there. So you're creating basic components and more advanced components and then merging those all together into a block wrapper. I assume there's going to be some sort of automation there. I can't imagine you're going to have to manually queue up all those components and then queue up a block wrapper afterwards. I'm assuming this new production system is going to allow the automation of all that process. I assume it's kind of going to be a basic version of how a lot of factory building games like Factorio and Satisfactory work. I quite like automating stuff in games, so this is something I'm looking forward to. On a live stream, we were told that there are plans to add 2 moons in this update, but we haven't actually seen any visuals of these moons. One of these moons we're already aware of, and that's a moon called Palatine, which will orbit Verger, the Earth-like planet in Space Engineers 2. So presumably the second moon will orbit Chemic, the Mars-like planet in Space Engineers 2, presumably mirroring how in Space Engineers 1, the Mars-like planet had Europa orbiting it, or perhaps they'll be more like the real-life moons of Mars, Phobos and Deimos. And I assume both of these moons will be used for future contract locations as well. One last thing to mention that's coming in the 2.2 update is rebindable controls. Now, currently you can rebind keys outside the game using a third-party tool called Space Editor, but in 2.2 you'll be able to edit them directly in-game. And additionally, in a recent tweet by Marek Rosa, the CEO of Keen Software House, the developers of Space Engineers 2, it was revealed that keybinds in Space Engineers 2 would be much more open than they were in Space Engineers 1. And additionally, as the game develops, more advanced control systems will be added as well. Before we move on to the 2 other major updates on the roadmap, I want to briefly mention one feature that isn't coming in this update, and that is wheels. We have seen images of wheels, so they've definitely been worked on, and to be fair, we've also seen images of hinges. But as I've already mentioned, those aren't coming in this update either. Now it's worth noting that Vertical Slice 2.2 might not be the last update we receive before the next major update, as we may receive another major update in between this and the next major update. Or additionally, everything that we've currently been told about this update, and also future updates, is all subject to change, so maybe wheels will make their way into this update, or any of the other updates that we'll talk about later in the video. So if you want to find out when wheels are coming to the game, or any other feature that we talk about in this video, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel to keep up to date with everything Space Engineers. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's talk about the next 2 major updates for Space Engineers 2, water and multiplayer. The water update and the multiplayer update are being worked alongside each other with 2 separate teams working on them, and currently we've been told that whichever one of these 2 updates is finished first will be the one that releases. So if multiplayer is done first, we'll be getting a multiplayer update first, and if water is done first, we'll be getting a water update first. Currently the roadmap shows water being the next update, so we'll talk about that one first. If you've played Space Engineers 2, you'll know that there are vast empty areas on Verger, the Earth-like planet, where clearly water is meant to be. These are just empty ocean beds, just begging to be filled up with water. And obviously that will be fulfilled when water is added to the game. But the developers have said that unfortunately, when water is added to the game, you'll have to create a new game if you want water to be added to the planets. They've said they want to avoid this in the future, having to create new worlds in order to experience new features. But unfortunately, for this specific feature, you will have to create a new world in order to have oceans on your planets. I want to do a video in the future where I talk about water in depth, purely from a mechanical side, as Space Engineers 2's water is going to be fully volumetric, meaning that you can pick up the water on your ship, you can move it around, you'll be able to build dams and wall off certain areas from water being in it, you'll be able to pick up water with a pump, then expel it out in other areas. Basically, it's going to work how you imagine water should work in a game, as opposed to a lot of games that just have a flat level of water underneath the level, or alternatively, if they're a game with planets and stuff, they will just have a flat level of water around the planet. Fully volumetric water will be a big deal for not only Space Engineers, but I think for video games in general. I think it's going to blow a lot of non-Space Engineers gamers' minds when they see this feature in action. And you can kind of look at it now. Using the debug menu in the game, you can access the current water that is in Space Engineers 2. And whilst it's definitely not the final version of water that will be released in the Vertical Slice 3 update, it's already very impressive what it can do. What you're seeing on screen here is a couple of other YouTubers showing off water, and I'll link in the description if you want to see them messing around with it. But even at this stage of development, where water is hidden in the debug menu to prevent us from seeing it in an incomplete state, it's still very impressive as I just said. And what's even more impressive is that in the original release of Space Engineers 2, you could also access water in the debug menu, and it was nowhere near as good as this, just being a blue gloopy mess that barely worked as water, let alone look like it. And additionally, the water that we can access now in the game is already a worse version of water than we've seen in teasers for the water system that were released months ago. So the implementation of water in Space Engineers 2 is already far ahead of what we can currently access. The number one concern I know a lot of people have with water in Space Engineers 2 is performance, and it must have been 3-4 years ago now when the developers first announced they were working on volumetric water. They released this live stream which went over how water could be implemented in a way that wouldn't cause performance issues, where it was only processed when a change was actively made to it. As water flowing, technically nothing is changing about it, all of that's already processed. So I would suggest you check out that stream if you're interested in how it all works. But if you want to see examples, the developers have released many examples showing off the volumetric water, many of them including this submarine here, where you can see it hopping in and out of the water and the water deforming as it goes in and out. And then you can see inside the submarine where they open a hole in the side of the submarine and then the water comes flowing from the outside in. We've also been shown like a million teasers of water flowing across different environments, filling up ravines and canyons. It all looks so good. I'm definitely going to have a lot of fun messing around with water when it's added to the game. When water is added to the game, they're going to add a water planet to the game called Byblos. And if you look in the map that is currently in Space Engineers 2, you can see there's a Byblos sector up here. So presumably the planet is going to be up here on the map. Until recently, we only had one picture of Byblos, which is this picture here, and this is a waterless version of this planet. So it's not even what this planet will look like in its true glory. However, last week we were finally shown our first proper images of Byblos. Now these are very early development photos of this planet, because the water you see down here is visually worse than the water that is currently in the game, which as I've said is also worse than the water we've seen in previous teasers, so this teaser of Byblos might be very old. However, as you can see, the majority of the planet is water, and there will be mountains that stick out of the water, a bit like how there was that one island in Subnautica. There's also this GIF here, which shows them toggling the water on and off of the surface of this planet. And you can see there's all these volcanoes, and there's these deep sea trenches, and I don't know what you'd call these, like the big holes in the ground. But it seems, like how there's a lot of detail on the surface of Verger and Chemic, there will also be a lot of detail underneath the water of Byblos. So it seems like deep sea exploration will be just as interesting as traversing the planets in Space Engineers 2. And that is a prospect that gets me very excited for the future of this game. Imagine contracts for the Byblos sector, where you have to recover things deep under the ocean, where you have to build a submarine specifically for that purpose. Yes, engineering in my engineering game, that's what I'm talking about. Alongside water and this new planet, we're also getting a bunch of other features. Swimming animations is a big thing. As I mentioned in a previous video, I kind of never really thought about this before. I kind of always assumed that going underwater would be like flying around in space, but just slower. But actually having swimming animations, that would be pretty cool. We've been told that there'll be pressure simulations at certain depths, and this is something that is very interesting to me, as presumably this will mean that the deeper you go, there'll be more pressure put against the surface of your ship, and I have no idea how that's going to work in game, so that's very interesting. Are you going to be using your Xbox controller to control your submarine on the depths of Byblos to search for hidden treasures, and all of a sudden you can hear a creaking and creaking, and then boom, your submarine explodes? Are you going to have to engineer your submarine so that they can survive those deeper depths? Once again, engineering in my engineering game? Yes, please. We know there's a bunch of new blocks that'll be coming in this update. We've recently been shown two different variants of water tanks, which you can see on screen here, a smaller variant and a larger variant. There'll be water turbines, which when water is running past them, they'll generate energy. And as I mentioned earlier, there'll be a pump block that can be used to both suck in water to put inside your water tanks and also expel water to put water in different places. Fill up your swimming pools, create new rivers, flood your friends' bases, etc, etc. Additionally, for underwater travel, there will also be the propeller block, which you can see here, and it has a little turbine on it, as you can see, which will propel you around when you're underwater. And presumably it will spin. And as I always say, I absolutely love spinning things in Space Engineers. Give it to me. Also, whilst we're looking closely at this image, do you see that? Do you see that over there? Yeah? Curious. What could that be? There's also a couple of other blocks that we know are coming. Ballast tanks are one of these things, which will presumably help us make proper ships that stay upright, and also submarines that go up and down. There was also previously in the files for the game a block called a gravity anchor, which is like a weight that you put underwater to keep something on top of the water in a certain position. Kind of like, you know, how a real anchor works. And I'm sure there'll be many other water related blocks that are also added in this update. We've been told that there will definitely be water-specific missions. As I've mentioned, this is something I'm very excited for. And additionally, there'll be ore underneath the water. Now, whether or not there'll be a specific ore that only appears underwater, or perhaps there'll be bigger ore veins underwater, we'll have to wait and see. But again, this adds further incentive to go underneath the water and explore what's down there. Now, there's a couple of other non-water related features we've been told that might be coming in this update, and the reason I say might is because some of the features I'm about to mention, we've already been told are coming in the 2.2 update we've previously mentioned. So it's possible that since this information was originally told to us, that some of these features have been moved up. However, we haven't been told that all of these features have been moved to the 2.2 update, so I'll have to see if we get more information in the future. Block wrappers, area welding, and the new welder and grinder blocks were all things I mentioned that were coming in 2.2. However, I also mentioned that I thought a new production system might be coming in 2.2 to coincide with those other features, but it hadn't been explicitly mentioned. But it was mentioned to be coming in the water update alongside block wrappers, area welding, and new welder and grinder blocks. So potentially that has been moved forward as well, or potentially this new production system is coming alongside the water update. We'll have to wait and see. We've also been told that the oxygen system is coming alongside water, which makes sense. Oxygen and water are kind of similar systems, as oxygen needs to be trapped inside of your ship so you can breathe, and water needs to be trapped outside of your ship so you don't drown. So there's a kind of complementary system to each other, so it kind of makes sense they're both coming in the same update. We've also been told that weather and weather effects will be coming in the water update, which kind of makes sense, stormy seas and all that. I do wonder if things like storms do actually affect the oceans, and will cause the surface of the water to be more turbulent, but we'll have to wait and see on all of that. I'm sure there'll be more things in the water update than just this, but that's all we currently know for now, and as I said previously, all of this is subject to change anyway. They've already removed features from this update and moved them forward, and potentially some of these features could come out in a later update, a 3.1 or a 3.2 update after this one. I'm sure we'll find out in the future. As I mentioned earlier, there are two major updates being worked on alongside each other. One of them is water, which we've just covered, and the second one I said was a multiplayer update. However, that's not strictly true. It's a cooperative multiplayer update and also an NPC update. The current plan is this update will introduce 4-player co-op, so you'll be able to play with 3 friends, and then in the future they'll release an update adding full multiplayer to the game with servers and stuff like that. There's not much more to say about multiplayer because, you know, it's just the same game playing with friends. It'll be a big deal when it comes out, but there's not much more to say on it at the moment. However, the main thing I am personally interested in this update is NPCs. Even now, in Space Engineers 2, there are many changes that make it better than Space Engineers 1. There are so many quality of life improvements and new features that make the game so much better to play. But the main issue Space Engineers 1 had was actually having a reason to play the game. It has got a lot better at that in recent years, adding a bunch of new encounters to the game and endgame content, but it's never quite hit that mark. And Space Engineers 2 has 2 solutions to this. One is already in the game, is the colonization and contract system, and so far I think that is very good, and I look forward to seeing how that develops in the future. And the second is NPCs. I personally think it's very important for Space Engineers 2 to get these systems right, that being colonization, contracts, and NPCs. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing how NPCs work in Space Engineers 2, as they're the last step that Space Engineers 2 needs to overcome in order to fix the issues with the first game. Now it's worth noting the wording they use here, which is that these are the first iteration of the interactive non-player characters, so it'll be interesting to see what that means. NPCs will serve 2 functions in the game. First of all, combat. They'll be the guys that fly ships and also protect the internals of them. There'll be ground troops on bases and planets and stuff like that, so they'll be a big part of the hostile encounters in the game. And additionally, there'll be friendly NPCs. NPCs that inhabit the stations of the game, that exist on the contract bases, that presumably you'll find out in the world inhabiting it. And we've been told previously that the contract system will heavily rely on these NPCs, and they'll replace the contract block, and NPCs will give out these contracts instead. We've been told that the aim for Space Engineers 2 is to have a living universe, and these NPCs will be a big part of that. Additionally, NPCs will also be heavily involved in the story of Space Engineers 2. We are currently aware of 4 factions in the game. The Legion of Engineers, which are a more militaristic faction, led by a character called Dante Appian, who currently voices all the teasers of Space Engineers 2. And we also have a second important character called Marie Gaia. Both of these characters are mentioned many times in the loading screens for the game. And additionally, we've been shown what the models for both of them look like for when they'll be added to the game, so presumably they'll be a major part of Space Engineers 2. The second faction we're aware of is the Astronauts Without Borders, which are a more cooperative faction, and we've recently been shown one of their designs of an NPC called Aya, which you can see on screen here, and it seems like she'll be a fairly important character in Space Engineers 2. I'm currently presuming that she'll be one of the first NPCs we meet in the game on Valation Station, the station above the Earthlight planet where we start, but that is yet to be seen. As far as we're aware, she's not in any leadership role, so it seems likely her function will be very early in the story, as opposed to being a faction leader or something like that. There are 2 more factions that we have heard of, but we haven't seen anything about. These are the Boatmen, which apparently had some sort of tragedy happen to them. Whether or not they'll have something to do with Byblos, the water planet, being literal boatmen, or boatmen is just a term for them as they are pirates or something like that. We'll have to wait and see, but we don't know much about them. And additionally, there's another faction called the Elokite community, which are kind of like religious cultists, and it seems some sort of tragedy befell them as well. And if you want to know everything to do with those factions, I've actually done a lore video going into all the lore of these factions, as there's actually quite a bit of it hidden in the files for the game, so check out that video if you're interested in that. This update is going to add the first iteration of interactive non-player characters, so it's possible that none of these named NPCs are actually going to be in this update, and instead it's going to focus on the combat side of NPCs. Alternatively, it could be the other way around, and it focuses on these named characters, not necessarily story-related ones, but instead NPCs to populate the stations, and also to appear during contracts instead. So, everything else. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, after co-op multiplayer is added to the game, the focus after that will be full multiplayer, and we have been told that they're currently looking at how colonization will work in multiplayer. And this is speculation on my part. I presume that colonization in multiplayer will involve players actually taking control of sectors, rather than colonization for progression. I assume the fact that this map exists, the developers must be considering some sort of faction control system with this as well. And if not, you know this is the first thing modders will be looking at when multiplayer is added to the game. Separate from multiplayer, there is the storyline and campaign. This is something they're going to work on towards the end of the development once all the features are in the game. Obviously, you need all the things like all the sectors, all the planets and NPCs to be in the game before you can actually add a fully functional storyline to the game. And we've also been shown one of the things they're working on at the moment is animations for the player characters so they can better realise the story for the campaign, adding more dynamic cutscenes and stuff like that. As, if you've seen the intro cinematic for Space Engineers 2, it's a lot of characters just standing around and looking at each other because those animations aren't currently in place. And of course, there'll be many updates in between all the updates we've just mentioned, and also afterwards, that add and improve many of the mechanics and features of the game. And once all those features and mechanics are in the game will likely move into beta, and the beta period will be a large optimization push for the game, where the developers get the performance of the game ready for an official release. There's a couple of features I know many people have asked about that currently aren't on the roadmap for the game, but the developers have spoke about them. I know one of the most common questions is orbital mechanics and aerodynamics. These are features that the developers are interested in, but during early access they want to focus on the core features of the game and getting those right first. And once they've completed that and got the game out of early access to official release, they've said that they would like to look at these features. Space Engineers 1 had a lot of feature bloat as they kept adding features that players requested during the early access period, which eventually resulted in the game spending 6 years in early access. For Space Engineers 2, to avoid this, they have a very strict roadmap and vision for the game, with the idea to get the game finished and out of early access within 2 to 3 years, and then after that, they will start to look at the most requested features of the community. So, which feature of Space Engineers 2 are you most excited for? Let me know with a comment below. And if you want to keep up to date with what is coming in these updates, and everything else to do with Space Engineers 2, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel, as we will definitely be covering it here. And if you want to go the extra mile and support this channel, you can become a YouTube member or a patron with the links in the description below, like these wonderful people on the left have.